The story begins in 1999 in Los Angeles, where a wealthy businessman named Fuller, who owns a multi-billion-dollar computer enterprise, has invented a virtual reality simulation set in 1937. In this world, all beings are computer programs, but they are unaware of it, believing their world is real. This virtual reality is connected to the real-world minds of people in 1999 through a special link. When someone connects, their consciousness is transferred into a character in the 1937 simulation. During this process, the original character in 1937 experiences a blackout. When the person returns to their world, the experience feels incredibly real. Mr. Fuller specifically chose 1937 for this simulation because he was nostalgic about his youthful days and frequently revisited that time. Fuller frequently visits 1937 in the virtual world, reliving his youthful days and flirting with women. However, the people in 1937 believed their world was real, unaware that they were just computer programs. Just as we think our world is real, they do too. Whenever Fuller enters this virtual world, he visits a particular hotel and hands a bartender a letter, instructing him to give it to a man named Douglas. Douglas, his assistant in 1999, also connected to the virtual world. Before Douglas arrives, the bartender reads the letter and is shocked. Fuller returns to the real world, where he lives with his wife, but he seems disturbed. He has discovered a shocking truth that he needs to share with Douglas. He goes to a hotel and calls Douglas, but when Douglas doesn't answer, Fuller leaves him a voice note. Suddenly, someone arrives at Fuller's door. Seeing the person, Fuller smiles as if he was expecting them. They step outside together, and the visitor, wearing an overcoat, kills Fuller before leaving. The next morning, Douglas wakes up, meaning he has been in the virtual world all night. As he enters the bathroom, he notices bloodstains on the bathtub and a blood-soaked shirt. Before Douglas can understand anything, he receives a voice message from Detective Larry asking him to come to the police station immediately. Confused, he goes to meet the detective and learns that someone has murdered Mr. Fuller, and Douglas is the prime suspect. Meanwhile, Mr. Fuller's daughter, Jane, arrives. She wants to shut down the virtual world of 1937 completely. Douglas is shocked because Fuller never mentioned having a daughter. As they talk, Douglas becomes impressed with Jane, and soon, they develop a relationship. Later, a man who works at the hotel where Fuller was murdered approaches Douglas. He claims to have witnessed Douglas committing the murder and demands money to stay silent. Douglas refuses, confident that he didn't kill Fuller. The man then testifies against him, leading to Douglas' arrest. However, Jane believes Douglas is innocent and arranges for his bail. Determined to prove his innocence, Douglas listens to a voice note that Fuller sent him before dying. In the message, Fuller reveals that he discovered a secret that could change everything. He instructs Douglas to go to the virtual world of 1937, where he has hidden the truth in a letter. Douglas decides to enter the virtual world and, before doing so, checks the computer records to see who Fuller last interacted with there. He discovers that Fuller last met with a bartender at a hotel. Using the computer program, Douglas also travels to the year 1937. While his physical body remains in 1999, his consciousness transfers into a character in 1937 who works at a bank. Douglas goes to the same bar where Fuller had given the letter to the bartender. He asks, "My name is Douglas. Did Mr. Fuller leave a letter for me?" However, the bartender denies it. Douglas wants to investigate further, but his time in the virtual world runs out, and his consciousness returns to his body in 1999. This proves that every person transferring their mind into the virtual world has a time limit. The characters in 1937, designed by the computer, live their lives just as real people do, believing their world is real. Meanwhile, those entering the simulation know it is only a computer-generated reality. When Douglas returns to his real world, the 1937 bank employee, whose consciousness he had taken over, is shocked to find himself inside the bar. He asks the bartender how he got there. The bartender, who already knows him, is also surprised by his strange behavior. Back in 1999, Douglas remains the prime suspect in Fuller's murder. Additionally, the bartender from the real world, who had told the police about Fuller's last night, has also been murdered. Douglas had gone to meet him, though he had no memory of it. Now, Douglas is certain that the letter in the 1937 virtual world can prove his innocence. He once again enters his avatar in the virtual world. This time, he meets the character who serves as Mr. Fuller's avatar, the one into whom Fuller transferred his consciousness whenever he entered the simulation. However, this character has no memory of it. That's because when someone's consciousness from the real world is transferred into a virtual character, the original mind of the 1937 character goes into a sleep mode and remembers nothing. Now, Douglas meets 1937's Mr. Fuller, who is confused about his life. Often, when he wakes up, he finds the scent of expensive perfume on his body and recently discovers a hidden, luxurious suit in his home. Douglas tells him, "I want to understand this too. I can help you, but you need to trust me." He takes Fuller to the same bar and asks, "Have you ever been here before?" Fuller replies, "No, but everything here looks strangely familiar. It feels like I'm experiencing odd hallucinations." In reality, the virtual world's characters retain faint, fragmented memories of past consciousness transfers. Douglas then asks Fuller, "Try to remember. Do you recall handing someone a letter here?" Fuller concentrates and says, "I think I gave an envelope to the bartender." As Mr. Fuller points toward him, the bartender tries to escape, but Douglas chases him into a room. There, the bartender pulls out a gun and demands, "Who are you?" One moment, you're a normal bank employee, and the next, you become Douglas and start investigating. "I know that the old man with you is not the real Mr. Fuller. I want you to bring him to me. I have some questions for him." Douglas realizes that the bartender has read the letter. He asks, "What was written in it?" The bartender replies, "It said that this world is fake." At first, I didn't believe it, but then I followed the instructions written in the letter. It told me to go where I wasn't supposed to ignore every barrier and stop sign. So, I drove my car down the road. I passed barriers, ignored stop signs, and eventually, I reached a desert. What I saw there left me stunned, because the world had ended. That's when I understood, this isn't the real world. This virtual world has boundaries, just like in video games, where characters can't move beyond certain areas. The program running this world has limitations, preventing characters from going beyond a set perimeter. Otherwise, they'd discover the truth, just like I did. Now, realizing the reality of his existence, the bartender shoots at Douglas. A struggle ensues, and both fall into a pool, causing the letter to get soaked. The ink smudges, erasing all the words written on it. Meanwhile, Douglas' time in the virtual world runs out, and his consciousness returns to his real body in 1999. Earlier, when Douglas returns to his body in 1999, he finds Whitney, his colleague, in front of him. Douglas tells Whitney that the minds of the people in the virtual program function just like real humans, and if they ever learn that their world is fake, everything will collapse. That's why he decides to shut down the company and never interfere with that world again. Whitney tries to convince him otherwise, arguing that they spent years developing this program and can't just shut it down. But Douglas doesn't listen. Instead, he goes straight to the hotel to find Jane, only to learn that she has already left. Just then, Detective Larry arrives and tells Douglas that Jane has disappeared because she was lying to everyone. She was not Mr. Fuller's daughter but a fraud pretending to be her. Douglas refuses to believe this. After the detective leaves, he asks a cab driver where he last dropped Jane off. The driver says, "At a supermarket." Douglas rushes to the supermarket, where he finds Jane working as a cashier. But when he approaches her, she doesn't recognize him. Her clothes, mannerisms, and entire personality seem different. She introduces herself as Natasha. As Douglas turns to leave, Natasha suddenly runs after him and says, "I feel like I know you. Have we met before?" Douglas, still in shock, replies, "No," and walks away. As she leaves, his mind races with confusion. Remembering the letter's words, "Move forward without stopping, without barriers, and you will discover the truth," Douglas does exactly that. He gets into his car and keeps driving straight ahead. As Douglas keeps driving forward, he reaches a desert, and what he sees ahead completely blows his mind. There is no real world beyond, just the edges of a computer simulation. The year 1999, the world he thought he was living in, is nothing more than another virtual program. His entire existence is part of a simulation, and the real world exists elsewhere. Meanwhile, back at the supermarket, Natasha's eyes flicker with a strange glow. Then, suddenly, she changes again. She is no longer Natasha, but Jane, as Jane's consciousness returns to her body. She immediately calls Douglas and asks him to meet her. When they meet, Douglas, still shaken by his discovery, asks, "I know the truth now. What year are you really from?" Which world do you belong to? And how many more virtual worlds like this exist? Jane reveals, I come from the real world, from the year 2024. There are many such virtual worlds, but yours is unique. Your world has created its own virtual simulation, just like we did in 2024. Douglas, still piecing it all together, asks, did you kill Mr. Fuller in our world? Jane replies, no. I was sent here, disguised as his daughter, after his death. My mission was to inherit his company and shut down this entire computer simulation, ensuring that no more virtual worlds were created within it. But I failed, because Fuller transferred ownership of the company to you before he died. Douglas now realizes that he was the one who killed Mr. Fuller in this world because he himself is just a character in a computer program. This means that someone from the real world, from the year 2024, entered his consciousness and made him kill Mr. Fuller. That explains the bloodstains on the bar counter and the blood-soaked shirt. The hotel employee recognized him because he had actually committed the murder. And not just Fuller, he had also killed the hotel employee. In reality, someone from the real world took control of his mind and forced him to commit both murders. Now, everything becomes clear to him. He is deeply disturbed, realizing that Mr. Fuller from this virtual world was killed because he had discovered the truth. And the one who killed him was none other than Douglas himself. Jane tells Douglas, don't blame yourself. It wasn't really you. The one who took control of your body and mind is my husband in the real world, his name is David. In 2024, when Mr. Fuller created this program, he used to visit different virtual worlds to fulfill his desires. My husband, David, did the same. But unlike Fuller, he is a psychopath. He enjoys killing people in virtual worlds. It gives him pleasure. And now, he wants to kill me in the real world too because he knows that after coming to your world, I fell in love with you. He cannot tolerate that. Douglas embraces Jane because he loves her too. Meanwhile, we see Douglas's colleague, Whitney, who also wants to experience the virtual world. Using the computer program, he transfers his consciousness to the year 1937. His consciousness enters the bartender's mind, who is driving at that moment. When he arrives in that world, he feels amazing. However, he had been driving recklessly, so the police approached him, suspecting he was drinking. The bartender says, I made a mistake, I won't drive anymore. Just then, a noise comes from the car trunk. When the officer opens it, inside is Douglas from 1937, the man whose body was once controlled by Douglas's consciousness from 1999. The bartender, now controlled by Whitney's consciousness, tries to run, but a truck crashes into him. Upon impact, Whitney wakes up in his real world, 1999, but he starts behaving strangely. Concerned, the company's security guard calls Douglas. Douglas returns to the company and finds Whitney happily watching TV, as if seeing it for the first time. When Douglas approaches, Whitney says, so this is your real world. It turns out that the bartender's consciousness has now entered Whitney's body in the virtual world. When the bartender died in the 1937 accident, Whitney's consciousness was still inside him, so Whitney's consciousness was lost, and the bartender's consciousness transferred to 1999 into Whitney's body. The bartender, now in Whitney's body, holds a gun and demands to see where he was programmed. Douglas, realizing he is just another character like him, chooses not to reveal the truth. Instead, he takes him to the place where the entire computer program was created, floor 13. As they reach floor 13, a strange glow appears in Douglas's eyes. This means that David's consciousness from 2024 has now entered his body. Now, Jane's husband, David, has completely taken over Douglas's body, meaning that whatever Douglas does is David's actions. Both of them enter the computer room, where Douglas kills the bartender. Then, he goes straight to where Jane is. She is unclothed, making him realize that Douglas and Jane spent the night together. This enrages him, and he wants to kill her. Jane, trying to save her life, runs outside, but her husband chases after her, intent on killing her. He points a gun at her, but before he can fire, a detective arrives and shoots him, killing him. Jane had called the detective beforehand. The detective knows the whole truth and acknowledges that he, too, is just a part of a virtual worlds program, not a real human. He tells Jane, go back to your real world and never return. Let our world continue as it is. Meanwhile, in 2024, David wakes up. However, while the body is still David's, the mind inside is Douglas's. When the detective shot Douglas in 1999, David's consciousness was inside his body, meaning both his body and consciousness died at that moment. Because of this, Douglas's consciousness is transferred into David's real-world body. Now, Douglas will live in the real world as David. Jane arrives and is overjoyed to see Douglas in David's body because this was her plan all along. She knew her husband, David, was a psychopath and a disgrace to humanity. Now, her plan has succeeded completely. After that, she takes Douglas outside and shows him the world of 2024, which is highly advanced. Seeing it, he is completely astonished. With this, the story comes to an end.